What if the Soviet Union had conquered all of Europe? If the Red Army had not stopped at Berlin in 1945? If its steel tide had swept onward, rolling across the battered landscapes of Western Europe, would the map of our world be painted in a single shade of crimson today? Would the Iron Curtain have been a wall around the entire continent, not just its eastern half? Would the voices of Europe speak in unison under the weight of Moscow's rule, or in whispers of rebellion beneath it? The spring of 1945 was a moment balanced on the knife edge of history. In our real timeline, the Allies closed in from two sides: the Soviets from the east, the Americans, British, and Canadians from the west. They met in the heart of Germany, dividing the ruins of Hitler's empire into spheres of influence, drawing a fragile line between competing visions of the future. But imagine another choice, one that could have changed the destiny of millions. Joseph Stalin, hardened by years of war and political purges, saw the Red Army's unstoppable momentum. His generals commanded armies seasoned by the blood-soaked campaigns from Stalingrad to Vienna. The Wehrmacht was shattered, its cities reduced to rubble, its soldiers surrendering in droves. In this alternate world, Stalin decides not to halt at agreed boundaries. The Soviet flag over Berlin is only the beginning. Instead of consolidating gains, Marshal Zhukov's tanks surge westward, ignoring the lines drawn at Yalta. The first shock comes in May 1945, as Soviet armored columns cross into the American-occupied zone of Germany without warning. The U.S. and British forces, still reeling from months of combat and the exhaustion of total war, find themselves staring down fresh Soviet divisions that seem endless in number. The war against Nazi Germany is officially over, but a new war, colder and far more dangerous, begins in the smoking ruins of Europe. In this imagined world, the Americans face a decision that could define the century: stand and fight, risking a Third World War, or fall back to preserve their forces for a later confrontation. In our story, they choose the latter. Europe's fate is sealed in the space of a few desperate days. By the time Paris hears the grinding of Soviet treads in its streets, the stars and stripes have already been lowered in retreat to the ports. London listens in horror as radio broadcasts from the continent grow fewer, replaced by the stern voice of Moscow's new People's Administrations. Britain braces behind its channel defenses, rushing to fortify coastal batteries and scrambling Spitfires for patrols. But even there, shadows of doubt stretch long. Europe, from Warsaw to Lisbon, is about to become a single, massive satellite under the hammer and sickle. Yet conquest alone is not enough for Stalin. He understands that military victory must be cemented with political control. New communist governments are installed with ruthless speed in Paris, Rome, and Madrid, each led by exiled radicals now returning as Moscow's loyal servants. Secret police agencies, modeled on the NKVD, appear almost overnight, rooting out dissent before it can breathe. Statues of Marx and Lenin rise in city squares where monarchs and generals once stood. The Vatican, surrounded in a sea of red, becomes the last symbolic voice of defiance in Western Europe, its speeches smuggled out by clandestine couriers. The United States, humiliated by its retreat, turns inward to regroup, shipping home troops and evacuating key European scientists, politicians, and cultural figures before the Soviets can claim them. Washington declares the creation of a Free Europe Committee in London, funding exiled governments and resistance broadcasts. But these are whispers against the roar of Soviet power. Across the Atlantic, the American public watches in disbelief as the map changes almost daily. The Mediterranean, the North Sea, and the Atlantic coast are dotted with Soviet flags. Lisbon, Brest, and Naples become hubs for the Red Navy, projecting power into waters once dominated by Western fleets. And yet, despite the appearance of total domination, fault lines are already forming beneath the surface of Stalin's new empire. A continent is conquered, but the hearts of its people are far from surrendered. In the shadows of Soviet triumph, resistance is beginning to stir, and somewhere, in the quiet halls of the Kremlin, Stalin's gaze shifts beyond Europe, to the far horizon, where a new and far more dangerous contest may await. In this alternate 1945, Moscow is both triumphant and burdened with the weight of its sudden empire. Stalin knows that holding Europe will require far more than victory parades. It will demand the swift transformation of shattered nations into loyal satellites, bound by ideology and fear. The Soviet economy, already strained to breaking point after 4 years of devastating war, now faces the impossible task of feeding and rebuilding an entire continent under its grip. But the Kremlin does not hesitate. Propaganda machines roar to life, framing the Soviet advance not as conquest, but as liberation from the chains of capitalism and imperialism. In Paris, Rome, and Madrid, hastily formed people's committees replaced the old governments staffed by long-exiled communists who return as Moscow's envoys. The NKVD spreads like a shadow through the ministries and police stations, dismantling political opposition before it can organize. Newspapers are seized, their presses now churning out slogans in praise of Stalin and the revolution. In the streets, portraits of Lenin hang from balconies, and red banners stretch across avenues once lined with national flags. The Vatican, defiant in the heart of Soviet Italy, becomes an island of resistance, its sermons carefully coded to avoid outright suppression, yet clearly aimed at sustaining the spirit of a conquered people. The United States, still reeling from the loss of continental Europe, focuses on evacuating as many scientists, engineers, and cultural figures as possible before the Soviet net tightens completely. Ships loaded with minds like Wernher von Braun, prominent French mathematicians, and dissident writers cross the Atlantic under military escort. London becomes the headquarters of the Free Europe movement, broadcasting clandestine radio messages into occupied territory. But each signal is jammed within hours by Soviet countermeasures. Meanwhile, the Red Army consolidates its grip. In Germany, the occupying forces strip factories and railways for parts, shipping machinery eastward to rebuild Soviet industry. In France, the ports of Brest and Marseille are transformed into forward operating bases for the Soviet Navy, their docks crowded with submarines and destroyers flying the hammer and sickle. In Spain and Portugal, once neutral or fascist-leaning, communist administrations rise under the watchful eyes of Soviet commissars, and Soviet aircraft patrol the skies over the Strait of Gibraltar, effectively sealing the Western Mediterranean. Yet the Kremlin's ambitions extend beyond Europe's shores. With the continent secured, Stalin begins to dream of pushing Soviet influence across the Atlantic. Intelligence reports from Washington speak of large-scale shipbuilding in Leningrad and Sevastopol, not for civilian reconstruction, but for the creation of a true blue-water navy. Soviet submarines begin probing the edges of American and British naval patrols, testing response times. Across Europe, the occupation is met with a spectrum of reactions. Some citizens, weary of decades of political turmoil, embrace the promise of stability under communism. Others join underground resistance networks, moving weapons, and printing banned pamphlets in basements. In Paris, a cell calling itself the Free Commune plants explosives in a government office, sparking a wave of arrests that ends with mass executions at dawn. Fear becomes the Soviet Union's most potent weapon. But fear alone cannot silence every whisper of rebellion. Stalin understands that ideology must be enforced with cultural reshaping. Schools are restructured to teach Marxist history from the first grade, religious instruction is outlawed, and youth organizations modeled on the Komsomol absorb millions of children. In universities, the works of Western philosophers are removed from shelves, replaced with Soviet political theory and scientific materialism. Over the airwaves, Radio Moscow transmits a steady diet of triumphant speeches, revolutionary songs, and denunciations of the imperialist United States. Across the ocean, the American public grows restless. Many demand intervention, arguing that retreat has only emboldened Soviet aggression. But President Truman, aware that Europe has already slipped beyond reach, instead turns to fortifying the Western Hemisphere, forming a new defensive alliance with Canada and Latin America. The Atlantic is no longer a vast buffer. It is now the only barrier between two hostile worlds. Inside Stalin's private chambers, maps are redrawn again and again, not just of Europe, but of the entire globe. The Soviet Union has done the unthinkable. It has conquered the heart of the old world. The question now is not whether it can hold it, but how far it dares to push before the final collision with the United States becomes inevitable. By 1947, the Soviet Union's hold over Europe is no longer just a military occupation, but a political reality that shapes every waking moment of life, from the Baltic to the Atlantic. The red banners no longer flutter as foreign symbols. They have become part of the daily landscape, stitched into the rhythm of markets, schools, and factories. The NKVD's network of informants stretches into every neighborhood, turning neighbors into suspects and friends into silent watchers. Stalin understands that empires are not held by guns alone. They are maintained by the slow erosion of alternative thought, the remolding of history, and the creation of a future in which no other path seems possible. The transformation is swift and ruthless. Currency reforms bind national economies to Moscow, wiping out private savings and forcing dependency on Soviet-controlled credit and trade. Agriculture is collectivized in France, Spain, and Italy, dismantling centuries-old farms and placing them under state cooperatives. Resistance to these changes is met with swift retribution. Families accused of hoarding grain are deported eastward, their homes seized by the state. Cultural life is re-engineered to serve the revolution. In Berlin, opera houses now stage performances extolling the heroism of the Red Army, while in Paris, avant-garde artists either adapt to socialist realism or disappear into obscurity. In Madrid, entire libraries are purged, their shelves refilled with Russian translations of Marx, Engels, and Gorky. Even language itself begins to bend under Soviet influence. Schoolchildren learn Russian as a mandatory subject, and Soviet terms seep into everyday speech. Yet beneath the surface of conformity, a different Europe lives on in the shadows. In the catacombs under Rome, priests hold secret masses. In the forests of Brittany, former resistance fighters train young recruits. In the mountains of Yugoslavia, where Soviet control is less absolute, smuggling routes move messages, weapons, and people across borders under the cover of night. These networks are fragile, infiltrated often, but their persistence is a reminder that Stalin's empire rests on unstable ground. Across the Channel, Britain becomes both fortress and prison for the remnants of free Europe. London's streets are filled with exiled governments, plotting endlessly over maps of a continent they can no longer touch. The British public, exhausted from years of war, is divided. Some see resistance as noble but futile. Others call for rearmament and confrontation. The United States watches from across the Atlantic, caught between two impulses: the urge to liberate Europe and the fear of triggering a global war that could end in nuclear annihilation. The Manhattan Project's success has given America a terrifying advantage, but Soviet intelligence has already stolen enough secrets to accelerate its own atomic program. By mid-1947, American reconnaissance flights over Siberia detect massive industrial complexes believed to house uranium enrichment facilities. The race for nuclear supremacy is no longer theoretical. It is a sprint with no finish line but catastrophe. Meanwhile, Soviet ambitions grow bolder. Stalin, sensing the United States' reluctance to engage directly, begins courting communist movements in Asia, Africa, and South America, offering them funding, training, and arms. The message is clear. The revolution will not stop at Europe's shores. In Washington, President Truman delivers a speech declaring the Americas a red line for Soviet expansion, warning that any attempt to infiltrate the Western Hemisphere will be met with force. The doctrine is well received domestically, but abroad it only hardens the perception that the world has split into two unbridgeable halves. In Europe, the propaganda war intensifies. Radio Moscow broadcasts tales of capitalist decay, painting the United States as an imperialist oppressor clinging to its colonies, while Soviet-controlled European stations air constant stories of industrial recovery, unity, and equality under communism. The truth, however, is less glorious. Food shortages persist, black markets thrive, and the once vibrant cities of Europe wear the tired face of ration lines and political rallies. In the Kremlin, Stalin pores over reports of growing unrest, aware that his empire, though vast, is far from unshakable. To secure it, he contemplates measures that will send shockwaves across the Atlantic and make the United States confront a choice it has so far avoided. For in this altered world, the first battles of the next Great War may not be fought in the skies over Europe, but in places far beyond its borders, where the red tide is beginning to lap at new shores. By 1948, the Soviet Union's dominion over Europe appears unshakable on the surface, but Stalin understands that empires collapse not from frontal assaults, but from the slow corrosion of loyalty and the rise of resistance within. To crush this possibility, he launches what the Kremlin calls the Great Integration, a sweeping plan to bind the economies, militaries, and cultures of every European nation directly to Moscow's will. National armies are dissolved and reconstituted as branches of the Red Army, their uniforms replaced, their officers vetted for ideological purity. The borders between former nations fade in all but name, replaced by administrative zones governed by Soviet commissars, their maps marked not with historic cities, but with production quotas and strategic assets. In the streets of Warsaw, Paris, and Rome, gigantic parades showcase military might, columns of tanks rolling past cheering crowds whose smiles are as carefully managed as the speeches from the reviewing stands. Behind the spectacle, the NKVD continues its unrelenting work, rooting out suspected dissidents, arresting academics, artists, and clergy accused of harboring counter-revolutionary thought. Entire universities are reorganized under Soviet curricula, with Russian language proficiency made a prerequisite for higher education. Religious institutions, particularly the Catholic Church, become the focal points of underground resistance, prompting Stalin to order a campaign of intimidation. Bishops are imprisoned, seminaries closed, and church properties nationalized. In the rural heartlands of France and Spain, collectivization transforms the countryside into a patchwork of state-run farms, their output redirected to feed Soviet troops and fuel the Kremlin's industrial ambitions. Farmers who resist are branded as saboteurs, their families deported to labor camps in the Urals. Despite the brutality, the propaganda machine insists that a new golden age has begun. Posters proclaim one people, one future in a dozen European languages, always with Russian printed above all others. Across the Channel, Britain watches with a mixture of dread and determination. Prime Minister Attlee faces pressure from within his government and from exiled European leaders to strike back, yet the logistical reality is grim. Britain's military, though intact, is dwarfed by the Soviet war machine. The United States sends aid and military advisors, but avoids direct confrontation, preferring to bolster the Western Hemisphere's defenses. American strategists know that a premature war could devastate the homeland, especially with Soviet troops stationed in Lisbon, Brest, and Naples, controlling vital Atlantic access points. Yet Stalin is not content with static borders. His gaze shifts toward the Middle East, a region rich in oil and strategically positioned between Europe, Asia, and Africa. Soviet diplomats begin courting newly independent states, offering economic aid and military training in exchange for alignment with the socialist bloc. In Iran, pro-Soviet factions, emboldened by the Kremlin's backing, push for political upheaval, threatening Western oil interests. In Egypt, Soviet advisors quietly enter the country under the guise of infrastructure projects, while in Turkey, pressure mounts along the eastern borders, backed by the presence of Soviet divisions in the Caucasus. In Washington, alarm bells ring as intelligence reports warn that Soviet influence could soon stretch from the North Sea to the Persian Gulf. President Truman authorizes a massive expansion of naval forces in the Mediterranean, but every move is shadowed by the risk of triggering open conflict. Meanwhile, inside Europe, cracks begin to show in the Soviet facade. Black markets flourish, fueled by goods smuggled from Britain and the Americas. Underground newspapers, printed on stolen presses, circulate seditious stories of life beyond the Iron Curtain, igniting dangerous dreams among the youth. In East Berlin, a protest over food shortages escalates into riots, only to be crushed by Soviet armor within hours. The world takes note, not because the uprising succeeded, but because it happened at all. Stalin, ever the strategist, knows that the greatest threat to his empire may not come from Washington's warships or London's broadcasts, but from within the streets of his own conquered cities. And so he begins to plan a purge on a scale Europe has not yet seen, one that will either secure his dominion for generations or set the stage for its sudden, catastrophic unraveling. By 1949, the Soviet grip on Europe tightens into something far more suffocating than mere occupation. It becomes a system, an all-encompassing reality from which escape seems impossible. Stalin's Great Purge of the West begins quietly, without public declarations, masked as a campaign for political hygiene and protection of the revolution. In truth, it is a calculated sweep through every level of society, aimed at removing anyone whose loyalty to Moscow is less than absolute. Local police forces are dissolved and replaced with Soviet-trained security units, answerable only to the NKVD. Factories are reorganized into military-industrial collectives, their output dedicated to arming the Red Army's ever-growing presence along the Atlantic coast. Food shortages, already severe, deepen as grain and livestock are diverted to feed troops and support Soviet campaigns in distant regions. Ordinary citizens learn to live with ration books, endless queues, and the knowledge that any complaint, even in whispers, could bring a midnight knock on the door. Across Europe's great cities, statues of Stalin rise beside Lenin and Marx, symbols of a new order meant to erase centuries of national identity. In Paris, the Eiffel Tower remains standing, but now flies a massive red flag, its image broadcast across Soviet newsreels as proof of the Kremlin's liberation of the West. In Rome, the Colosseum is used for mass political rallies, its ancient stones echoing with speeches about the triumph of socialism over imperialism. In Berlin, whole neighborhoods are bulldozed to make way for vast government complexes, built in the severe architectural style of Moscow. The Vatican stands as the last institution openly defiant, and Stalin responds by surrounding it with checkpoints, cutting off access to pilgrims, and jamming broadcasts from the Pope. In Britain, the sense of encirclement grows. Soviet fleets patrol the English Channel, their presence a constant reminder that the island stands alone on the edge of a communist continent. Prime Minister Attlee, under pressure from both the United States and domestic hardliners, begins a program of military rearmament unprecedented in peacetime. American bombers are stationed in Scotland, their nuclear payloads intended as the ultimate deterrent. Washington formalizes the Atlantic Defense Pact with Britain, Canada, and a handful of South American allies, making clear that any Soviet advance beyond Europe will be met with force. Stalin, however, sees opportunity in the very caution of his enemies. Knowing the West fears a nuclear exchange, he begins to push Soviet influence into North Africa. In Algeria, communist cells gain weapons and training from Soviet advisors, operating through clandestine networks in Marseille. In Morocco and Tunisia, anti-colonial movements are co-opted. Their leaders promised Soviet support for independence in exchange for ideological alignment. The Mediterranean becomes a chessboard, with Soviet and American fleets shadowing each other's movements, testing reactions in a silent but deadly game. Within occupied Europe, resistance adapts to survive. No longer relying solely on armed uprisings, underground networks turn to sabotage, information leaks, and cultural subversion. In Madrid, dissidents infiltrate Soviet-controlled radio stations, slipping coded messages into music broadcasts. In the French countryside, trains carrying weapons to Soviet bases are derailed under the cover of night. In Berlin, a network of students begins smuggling photographs of life in the Free West, taken from British newspapers, into the hands of young workers hungry for proof that another world exists. But the Kremlin's control mechanisms are formidable. For every act of defiance, there are arrests, disappearances, and public trials designed to instill fear. Families are torn apart, children indoctrinated from their earliest years to see the state as their only parent. Entire generations grow up speaking Russian fluently, their native tongues slowly eroded by the constant presence of Soviet culture. And yet, despite the iron grip, Stalin's intelligence reports paint a troubling picture. Economic productivity is faltering, morale is slipping, and whispers of rebellion are spreading faster than the NKVD can contain them. The Soviet leader, calculating as ever, concludes that the time has come to distract both his own people and the conquered masses with a new, unifying cause, something that will rally them behind the red banner and turn their eyes away from hardship. His solution is bold, dangerous, and unprecedented. The Soviet Union will not merely defend its empire, it will expand it beyond anything the world has yet imagined, forcing the United States to face the question it has long avoided: how far will it go to stop the march of communism? By the dawn of 1950, Stalin's vision for the Soviet Empire shifts from consolidation to expansion, and his eyes settle firmly on the Middle East as the next great prize. The region's vast oil reserves promise the fuel needed to sustain Soviet industry and military might for decades, while its position as a crossroads between Europe, Asia, and Africa offers strategic leverage over 3 continents. The Kremlin moves carefully at first, using diplomacy and economic aid to court newly independent nations, but beneath this soft power lies a steel core of military planning. Soviet arms shipments, disguised as agricultural equipment, arrive in the ports of Alexandria and Beirut. Advisors in plain clothes begin training local militias under the guise of defensive preparedness. In Iran, where Allied forces had once shared occupation with the Soviets during the war, Moscow orchestrates a coup through sympathetic officers, toppling the fragile government and installing a regime loyal to the Kremlin. This sends shockwaves through Washington and London, which had counted on Iran as a vital source of oil and a buffer against Soviet influence in Asia. In Turkey, the pressure is more direct. Soviet divisions mass along the eastern border, and naval forces in the Black Sea conduct aggressive maneuvers near the Bosporus, signaling that control of this crucial waterway is no longer negotiable but inevitable. The United States, unwilling to provoke a war it may not win, limits its response to economic sanctions and increased military aid to allies in the region. Britain, overstretched and still recovering from the loss of Europe, cannot mount an independent defense. This emboldens Stalin, who now sees the Mediterranean not as a contested space, but as an emerging Soviet lake. Across occupied Europe, the propaganda machine goes into overdrive, presenting the expansion into the Middle East as the continuation of the liberation struggle, casting Western powers as colonial oppressors desperate to cling to their fading empires. In Cairo, massive rallies organized by Soviet agents fill the streets with red banners and chants of solidarity with the people of Europe, Africa, and Asia. The message resonates with anti-colonial movements across the globe, drawing new allies into Moscow's orbit. Yet this aggressive push also carries risks. In the corridors of the Pentagon, planners warn that Soviet control over Middle Eastern oil would cripple the economies of the free world and give Moscow a stranglehold over global trade. President Truman authorizes Operation Sentinel, a covert program to arm and fund resistance movements, not only in occupied Europe but in the Middle East itself. American weapons begin appearing in the hands of insurgents in Iran and Turkey, smuggled through labyrinthine networks stretching from Greece to the Persian Gulf. Inside Europe, the Kremlin tightens its grip in anticipation of possible uprisings. Mass arrests sweep through Paris, Berlin, and Warsaw as suspected collaborators with Western intelligence are rounded up. In Italy, the port city of Naples becomes a fortress, its docks bristling with Soviet warships ready to sail at a moment's notice. Still, the mood among the conquered peoples is shifting. The older generation, worn down by war and deprivation, clings to survival, but the young, those who came of age under Soviet rule, begin to chafe against the constraints of a system that promises equality, yet delivers only scarcity and fear. They listen in secret to foreign broadcasts, trade smuggled books, and dream of a life unbound by the watchful eyes of the NKVD. Stalin, ever suspicious, sees this as the most dangerous front of all. In a chilling directive to his inner circle, he orders the expansion of cultural re-education programs and the creation of youth brigades tasked with rooting out dissent among their peers. The Soviet Union's reach has never been greater, but the seeds of resistance are everywhere. In the mountains of Turkey, in the back alleys of Paris, in the deserts of Iran. As Soviet troops march ever deeper into the Middle East, the world edges closer to a confrontation that neither side may be able to control. And in the shadows of the Kremlin, Stalin begins to consider a move so audacious it could change the balance of power forever, extending the red tide across the Atlantic itself. By 1951, the Soviet Union stands astride Europe and much of the Middle East like a colossus, its banners unfurled from Lisbon to Tehran, its warships patrolling seas that only a decade earlier had been dominated by the British Empire and the United States. Stalin, his health beginning to falter, but his ambition undimmed, sees the next phase of his grand design not merely in controlling continents, but in breaking the last psychological barrier between East and West, the Atlantic Ocean. For years, the United States has believed that the vast waters are a natural shield, a buffer against the reach of Soviet power. Now, Stalin intends to prove otherwise. The plan emerges in secret meetings deep within the Kremlin. Establish permanent Soviet military footholds in the Western Hemisphere, not through direct invasion, but through the slow, careful cultivation of allies and proxies among the discontented and the ambitious in Latin America and the Caribbean. Soviet intelligence, already adept at infiltrating governments in Europe, deploys its best operatives to Havana, Caracas, and Buenos Aires. In Cuba, still under the sway of corrupt regimes and deep economic inequality, Soviet agents fund underground labor movements, providing weapons, training, and political theory to young revolutionaries. In Venezuela, the Kremlin offers lucrative oil deals and technical support to sympathetic factions within the military, creating a network of officers loyal to Moscow's vision. In Argentina, disillusioned nationalists find common cause with anti-American rhetoric, opening channels for Soviet advisors disguised as trade representatives. In Washington, alarm grows as intercepted communications hint at a red belt forming along the southern approaches to the United States. The CIA, still a young agency, struggles to counter the flood of Soviet influence. Covert operations begin. Bribes to wavering politicians, smuggling of printing presses for anti-communist propaganda, and the quiet funneling of money to pro-Western unions. Yet the sheer scale of Soviet resources, drawn from the looted wealth and manpower of Europe and the Middle East, makes containment an uphill battle. Across occupied Europe, Stalin uses the looming shadow of this Atlantic expansion to tighten his grip. He tells the people that the struggle is global now, that the revolution is on the march to liberate the Americas from capitalist oppression. Massive rallies are staged in Paris, Rome, and Berlin, with soldiers marching in perfect formation, followed by floats depicting a future where the red flag flies over Washington. The propaganda resonates not only with those who believe in the ideology, but also with those desperate for a sense of purpose amid the grinding poverty and shortages of Soviet-controlled life. At sea, the Soviet Navy undergoes a transformation unprecedented in its history. Shipyards in Leningrad, Odessa, and Marseille operate day and night, constructing cruisers, submarines, and the first experimental aircraft carriers of the Red Fleet. Bases in Lisbon and Naples are expanded to house long-range bombers capable of reaching the eastern seaboard of the United States. Soviet submarines, now equipped with advanced snorkel technology and guided torpedoes, begin prowling the mid-Atlantic, testing the gaps in American sonar coverage. These moves are not without cost. The strain on the Soviet economy grows acute, and while Stalin's grip on power ensures no open dissent in the Kremlin, the intelligence reports from occupied territories are grim. Production quotas are missed, infrastructure projects stall, and food riots break out in the poorer districts of Warsaw and Barcelona. But the Generalissimo views these as temporary setbacks, distractions from the true prize that lies just beyond reach. The United States, for its part, begins to mobilize as it has not since the Second World War. The Atlantic Defense Pact is expanded into a full-fledged military alliance, with joint naval patrols, air defense networks, and contingency plans for a Soviet strike on the Americas. American bombers stand ready in Greenland and Newfoundland, while nuclear submarines lurk in the depths, tasked with shadowing any Soviet vessel that approaches too close. Yet even as both sides prepare for confrontation, neither is willing to strike the first blow, knowing that a single misstep could ignite a war that might end civilization itself. And so the game continues, a deadly dance of feints and counterfeints across oceans and continents. But within the Kremlin, Stalin begins to believe that hesitation is a luxury the Soviet Union can no longer afford, and his next order will push the world to the very brink. By 1952, the world exists in a state of unrelenting tension, a taut wire stretched between two superpowers whose spheres now brush against one another across every ocean and continent. The Soviet Union, having cemented its grip on Europe, the Middle East, and swaths of influence in Latin America, prepares to make the move that Stalin believes will tip the balance of history irreversibly in his favor. His plan is audacious, a show of force so vast, so undeniable, that the United States will have no choice but to accept the Soviet presence in the Western Hemisphere as a permanent reality. It begins with the Atlantic Fleet Initiative, a coordinated deployment of Soviet naval power that dwarfs anything seen since the end of the Second World War. From bases in Lisbon, Brest, and Naples, convoys of warships and supply vessels set sail under heavy escort. Their destinations cloaked in secrecy, Soviet submarines, already a constant menace in the mid-Atlantic, now travel in wolf packs, each led by a flagship equipped with new long-range missile systems capable of striking targets over 1,000 miles away. At the same time, in Havana and Caracas, pro-Soviet movements rise from the shadows into the open, emboldened by promises of direct military support. In Cuba, strikes paralyze the sugar industry, while in Venezuela, an attempted coup shakes the government to its core. American intelligence scrambles to respond, but the sheer speed of events makes containment nearly impossible. In Washington, the Pentagon draws up Operation Iron Shield, a plan to establish a chain of fortified bases from Florida to the Panama Canal, each equipped with radar installations, interceptor aircraft, and anti-submarine nets. The aim is clear: prevent the Soviets from gaining a foothold that could serve as a launchpad for attacks on the continental United States. Across occupied Europe, the propaganda machine shifts into overdrive, framing the push into the Americas as the final act of global liberation. In Paris, vast murals depict the Statue of Liberty draped in red, while in Berlin, schoolchildren are taught that the Atlantic is not a barrier, but a bridge to a new socialist dawn. Factories work around the clock to produce the ships, planes, and munitions needed for this unprecedented gamble, but the strain on resources begins to show. Shortages worsen, and whispers of discontent spread through the streets. In Marseille, dock workers strike over reduced rations, and in Warsaw, food riots erupt, only to be crushed by Soviet armored units. Stalin is aware of these cracks, but dismisses them as the inevitable cost of history in motion. For him, the logic is simple. If the Soviet Union can plant its flag in the Americas, the psychological blow to the United States will be so great that it will force a negotiated division of the world. Yet the Americans are not passive. In the Caribbean, U.S. Navy carrier groups conduct aggressive patrols, shadowing Soviet convoys and forcing them to alter course. In the skies over the mid-Atlantic, American reconnaissance planes engage in dangerous cat-and-mouse games with Soviet fighters launched from long-range carriers. Skirmishes occur, warning shots, near collisions, unacknowledged losses at sea, but both sides stop short of admitting them, fearing that public acknowledgement might demand retaliation. Behind closed doors, President Truman and his advisors debate whether to draw a line that, once crossed, will trigger open war. The Joint Chiefs argue that failing to act now will condemn the United States to perpetual strategic disadvantage. The State Department warns that a premature strike could ignite a nuclear exchange. And in Moscow, Stalin faces a mirror image of the same dilemma. He knows the United States has the capability to destroy Soviet cities in hours, yet he believes that fear of mutual annihilation will keep both sides from going too far. It is this belief, this gamble, that drives him forward, even as the world holds its breath. By the end of the year, Soviet forces are on the verge of establishing permanent bases in the Caribbean. The distance between the two great powers has never been smaller, and the margin for error has vanished entirely. One wrong move, one misunderstood signal, and the world could plunge into a war from which there will be no return. By 1953, the fragile balance between the Soviet Union and the United States is stretched to breaking point, with the Caribbean becoming the most volatile flashpoint on Earth. Soviet convoys continue to arrive in Cuban and Venezuelan ports under the cover of darkness, unloading crates of weapons, tanks, and aircraft components disguised as industrial machinery. In Havana, pro-Soviet militias march openly through the streets, their uniforms modeled after the Red Army, their banners bearing the hammer and sickle alongside Cuban revolutionary slogans. In Caracas, a pro-Kremlin faction within the military stages a coup, seizing control of key government buildings and radio stations before loyalist forces can respond. The United States, unwilling to tolerate a Soviet-aligned regime on the South American mainland, orders a naval blockade of Venezuela, prompting a direct challenge from Moscow. Soviet submarines begin shadowing U.S. destroyers, and skirmishes at sea become increasingly common, though both sides remain careful to avoid open declarations of war. In Washington, President Truman faces mounting pressure from Congress and the public to act decisively. The fear of Soviet missiles stationed within a few hundred miles of Florida grips the nation, and civil defense drills become a regular feature of American life. Across the country, sirens wail during practice alerts, families build backyard fallout shelters, and the media warns of the possibility of only minutes' warning before a nuclear strike. Yet even as the United States fortifies its southern defenses, the Soviet Union deepens its hold on the territories it has already claimed. In occupied Europe, the NKVD initiates the Continental Security Directive, a sweeping crackdown on dissent that sees tens of thousands arrested in a single month. Factories are militarized, with entire production lines dedicated to manufacturing parts for long-range bombers and intercontinental missiles. Soviet military engineers work feverishly to develop nuclear warheads small enough to be deployed from submarines, a breakthrough that would render the Atlantic no safer than the plains of Eastern Europe. Stalin, now visibly aged and increasingly isolated, drives his subordinates with a mix of paranoia and fervor, convinced that time is running out to secure his vision of a Soviet-dominated globe. Propaganda across Europe and the Middle East hails the Caribbean operations as the dawn of a new era, portraying the United States as a crumbling empire on the defensive. Mass rallies are staged in Paris, Rome, and Berlin, with colossal banners declaring that the Atlantic shall no longer divide the peoples of the world. But beneath the orchestrated enthusiasm lies growing fatigue. Shortages of food, fuel, and basic goods reach critical levels in several Soviet-occupied countries, leading to sporadic unrest. In Barcelona, workers strike for 3 days, refusing to return until their rations are restored. In Warsaw, an underground newspaper circulates a call for coordinated rebellion across the continent. The NKVD responds with characteristic brutality, but each act of repression fuels the very resistance it seeks to extinguish. In the Caribbean, the standoff intensifies. U.S. Marines conduct joint exercises with loyalist Venezuelan forces just miles from Soviet advisors, while American aircraft buzz the edges of Cuban airspace in calculated shows of force. Soviet naval commanders, under orders to avoid direct provocation, nonetheless prepare contingency plans for seizing control of strategic islands should hostilities break out. In both Washington and Moscow, war rooms run simulations that end with the same grim conclusion: any large-scale engagement will escalate to nuclear exchange within days. Still, neither side backs down. For Stalin, retreat would shatter the aura of inevitability that sustains his empire. For the United States, inaction would concede the hemisphere to Soviet influence. The world watches, breathless, as the line between peace and annihilation grows thinner by the hour, knowing that it may only take a single spark, a misinterpreted radar blip, an undisciplined captain, a failed communication, for history to plunge into its darkest chapter. And deep within the Kremlin, Stalin begins to consider whether the time for subtlety has passed, and whether the decisive blow must now be struck before the Americans dare to strike first. By early 1954, the world stands on the razor's edge, each day an exercise in brinkmanship where one misstep could plunge humanity into the abyss. Stalin, though weakened by illness, refuses to yield an inch in the Caribbean. His generals present him with Operation Red Horizon, a daring plan to formalize Soviet presence in the Western Hemisphere by establishing permanent military bases in Cuba and Venezuela, each equipped with long-range bombers, anti-aircraft batteries, and, most provocatively, nuclear-capable missile installations. The logic is brutal in its simplicity: force the United States to accept a Soviet military frontier just off its shores, creating a deterrent that would prevent any American attempt to liberate Europe or roll back Soviet gains elsewhere. In Havana, construction begins under heavy security, with entire neighborhoods cordoned off as restricted zones, guarded by Cuban militias and Soviet advisors. In Caracas, Soviet engineers arrive under diplomatic cover, bringing with them crates that are unloaded only at night and taken directly to fortified compounds. American reconnaissance aircraft capture grainy photographs of missile parts and radar arrays, sparking a firestorm in Washington. President Truman, nearing the end of his term, summons his military chiefs to consider preemptive action. The Joint Chiefs advocate for targeted airstrikes to destroy the installations before they become operational, warning that once active, they could deliver nuclear warheads to American cities in under 10 minutes. The State Department urges caution, pointing out that such a strike would almost certainly trigger Soviet retaliation in Europe, where millions of American allies live under the shadow of Red Army guns. Across occupied Europe, the strain of nearly a decade under Soviet rule is reaching a breaking point. In East Berlin, factory workers protest sudden wage cuts and the diversion of food supplies to overseas military operations. In Warsaw and Budapest, graffiti appears overnight. Short, defiant messages like, "We remember freedom," and "America will come." The NKVD responds with mass arrests, but even they cannot erase the growing sense that the empire's overextended. Soviet supply lines are stretched thin from Lisbon to Tehran to Havana, and partisan activity in the Balkans and North Africa forces the diversion of troops desperately needed elsewhere. Yet for Stalin, these are merely inconveniences, obstacles to be crushed with the same ruthlessness that brought him to power. The Soviet propaganda machine frames the Caribbean buildup as a defensive measure against American aggression, warning that Washington's true aim is to encircle and strangle the socialist world. Massive rallies in Paris and Rome show choreographed crowds chanting for solidarity with our brothers in the Americas, even as breadlines outside the stadiums tell a different story. In the United States, public opinion swings toward confrontation. Newspapers run front-page illustrations showing missile trajectories from Cuba to New York, Chicago, and Washington. Civil defense drills intensify, with schools practicing rapid evacuation to basements and subway tunnels. The Atlantic Defense Pact meets in emergency session, with Britain and Canada pledging naval support for a blockade of the Caribbean if the Soviets refuse to withdraw. At sea, the situation grows increasingly volatile. American destroyers shadow Soviet convoys heading toward Havana, sometimes closing to within visual range, while Soviet submarines trail the U.S. ships in turn. One tense encounter sees a Soviet subsurface unexpectedly between two American vessels, forcing evasive maneuvers that nearly cause a collision. The incident is quietly downplayed by both governments, but in the war rooms, it is recognized as a near miss that could have sparked disaster. In Moscow, Stalin sees time as his greatest enemy, not only because of his failing health, but because he knows the United States is accelerating its own missile program, soon to field weapons with ranges that could strike Soviet territory from deep within American borders. If the Soviet Union is to secure its position, it must act before that day comes. And so, with a mixture of desperation and conviction, he approves the final phase of Operation Red Horizon, the rapid deployment of fully assembled nuclear missiles to the Caribbean, to be operational within months. The gamble is immense, but in Stalin's mind, it is the only path left to ensure the survival of his empire. What he cannot yet see is that this move will set events in motion that neither he nor his enemies will be able to control. By the summer of 1954, Operation Red Horizon is in full motion, its pace relentless, its scope unprecedented. Soviet freighters disguised as merchant vessels crisscross the Atlantic under constant escort, their holds carrying not grain or machinery, but the heart of the Kremlin's gamble: nuclear-capable missiles, launch platforms, radar systems, and the technicians to assemble and maintain them. In Cuba, the once bustling neighborhoods of Havana's outskirts have been transformed into fortified zones bristling with scaffolding, fuel depots, and anti-aircraft guns. The local population, at first curious, is now kept at a distance by armed patrols, their streets patrolled day and night by a mix of Cuban militia and Soviet military police. In Venezuela, the government, now firmly in Soviet hands, declares a new era of continental solidarity, while in reality, Soviet engineers work feverishly to prepare launch sites deep in the jungles, far from prying eyes and difficult for American bombers to target. American reconnaissance missions increase in frequency and boldness. High-altitude spy planes capture clearer images of missile transport vehicles, camouflaged in fields, and radar dishes angled toward the north. In Washington, the debate within the Truman administration turns from cautious diplomacy to the inevitability of confrontation. The Joint Chiefs warn that within months, perhaps even weeks, the Caribbean sites will be capable of delivering nuclear strikes to the entire eastern seaboard. Pressure mounts for decisive action, and the public mood hardens. Editorials call for the immediate dismantling of Soviet installations by whatever means necessary. Across occupied Europe, news of the Caribbean buildup filters through in fragments, often smuggled via underground networks. For many living under the Soviet yoke, the idea of the United States taking direct action offers a flicker of hope that liberation might finally be possible. But they also fear that any such war would reduce their cities to rubble once more. In Paris, rumors swirl that American paratroopers are training in Britain for an eventual European campaign, while in Warsaw, the resistance distributes leaflets urging civilians to prepare for chaos if the front lines shift westward. In the Kremlin, Stalin follows every development with obsessive attention, his desk buried under maps and reconnaissance reports. His health is deteriorating, but his grip on decision-making remains ironclad. He believes the Americans will not dare initiate a full-scale war, that the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki has burned too deep into their strategic thinking. Instead, he envisions the missiles in Cuba and Venezuela as a bargaining chip, a way to force Washington into a permanent recognition of the Soviet sphere of influence across Europe, the Middle East, and now the Caribbean. The propaganda machine works tirelessly to frame the operation as a defensive shield, a noble gesture to protect the oppressed peoples of Latin America from Yankee imperialism. Massive rallies in Havana feature Cuban and Soviet flags flying side by side, speeches promising prosperity under socialism, and carefully staged displays of military hardware. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmer. In Havana, whispers of discontent grow among workers pressed into labor on the missile sites, their wages delayed, their food rations cut. In Venezuela, the dense jungle becomes a haven for anti-Soviet guerrillas, many trained and supplied by clandestine American operatives slipping across the Colombian border. Skirmishes between these insurgents and Soviet patrols become more frequent, leaving charred wreckage along remote riverbanks. At sea, the confrontation edges closer to disaster. An American destroyer intercepts a Soviet cargo ship suspected of carrying missile components. For hours, the two vessels shadow each other at close range, their crews at battle stations, until the Soviet ship abruptly changes course under orders from Moscow to avoid escalation. In the war rooms of both nations, simulations and war games offer no comforting outcomes. In almost every scenario, direct conflict escalates to nuclear exchange within days. Still, neither side is willing to retreat. Stalin instructs his admirals to accelerate the deployment schedule, even if it means bypassing some security protocols. His logic is clear. Once the missiles are operational, the United States will be forced to negotiate. But in Washington, the logic runs in the opposite direction. Once the missiles are operational, the window for safe intervention will close forever. As the clock ticks toward that point of no return, the world finds itself staring into the abyss, uncertain whether the next headline will announce a diplomatic breakthrough or the opening salvo of the Third World War. By the autumn of 1954, the world teeters at the edge of catastrophe, the air itself heavy with the expectation that the first shot is only days, perhaps hours away. In Cuba, Soviet crews work under floodlights through the humid nights, racing to complete missile installations before the Americans can act. In Venezuela, jungle sites are already partially operational, their launch pads hidden beneath elaborate camouflage nets, guarded by patrols that know any breach could invite an American strike. In Washington, President Truman convenes his National Security Council for what will be the most consequential decision of his presidency. Intelligence from high-altitude reconnaissance leaves no doubt the Soviet missiles are weeks from full operational readiness. The Joint Chiefs press for immediate, decisive action. A series of preemptive airstrikes and amphibious assaults to destroy the sites before they can threaten American cities. The State Department warns of certain Soviet retaliation in Europe and the Middle East, predicting a war that would engulf half the planet. Across occupied Europe, the tension is palpable. In Berlin, whispers spread that the Americans are preparing to land in France, while in Paris, underground networks stand ready to rise if Soviet forces are diverted to other fronts. The NKVD intensifies its sweeps, rounding up suspected sympathizers, sealing borders, and reinforcing garrisons along the Atlantic coast. Yet even within the ranks of the Red Army, unease grows. Soldiers mutter that the Caribbean gambit is reckless, that it invites a war no one can win. In the Kremlin, Stalin receives daily reports, his own health failing but his resolve unbroken. To him, backing down now would be to admit weakness before the entire socialist world. To undo a decade of expansion bought with rivers of blood, he orders the final phase of Operation Red Horizon to proceed, instructing his commanders to ready the Caribbean missiles for activation, even as he privately acknowledges to his closest aides that the risk of nuclear exchange is nearly certain. American naval forces tighten their blockade of the Caribbean, intercepting and turning back several Soviet supply ships. In one tense encounter, a Soviet submarine, cornered by depth charges near the Florida Straits, considers launching its nuclear-armed torpedoes before receiving a last-minute stand-down order from Moscow. The incident is kept secret from the public, but within the Pentagon, it is recognized as the moment the world came within a breath of annihilation. As the crisis reaches its peak, back-channel communications flicker to life between Washington and Moscow, mediated by neutral states desperate to avert disaster. Proposals are exchanged. The removal of missiles from Cuba and Venezuela in exchange for American recognition of Soviet control over Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Africa. A mutual non-aggression pact to freeze the global balance of power. Limited arms reductions to slow the nuclear arms race. The talks drag on, each side suspicious of the other's intentions, each knowing that delay could tip the scales toward war. In the streets of Havana and Caracas, the ordinary people live under the shadow of forces far beyond their control, listening to the distant rumble of warships and the constant drone of aircraft overhead. In New York and Washington, civil defense sirens sound without warning, part of relentless readiness drills. But each time they wail, citizens wonder if this time it is real. Then, in a move that shocks the world, Stalin dies suddenly. His death announced to the public only after several days of internal Kremlin maneuvering. The new Soviet leadership, facing the enormity of the crisis without the iron will of its architect, hesitates. Power struggles erupt behind closed doors, and for the first time, there is room for compromise. Within weeks, a secret agreement is reached. The Soviet Union will dismantle its Caribbean missile sites in exchange for an unspoken American acceptance of the new global map, one in which Europe remains under Soviet rule. Publicly, both sides claim victory, but the truth is more ambiguous. The crisis ends without the firestorm so many feared, yet the world that emerges is permanently altered. A globe divided cleanly in two, with an Atlantic no longer a buffer but a front line. The Iron Curtain now stretches across oceans, and every border is a potential battlefield. In this alternate history, the Soviet conquest of Europe has remade the century, locking humanity into a Cold War that spans not decades but lifetimes, where every child grows up under the shadow of the bomb, and the question lingers in every mind. Not if the war will come, but when. Would you want to live in such a world, knowing that peace is only a fragile pause between storms? If the Soviet Union had truly conquered all of Europe, would our history have been defined not by the wars we fought, but by the war we endlessly feared? Share your thoughts, your fears, and your vision of what might have been, because in imagining this world, we confront the choices that shaped our own.